Hello mates, welcome to the Baron Reviews. With me, the Baron. I'm the community manager for the game Blade and Sorcery, and I get asked quite a bit about Dismemberment and Decapitation, how I do it and how it works. So here is the Baron's official Dismemberment guide for Blade and Sorcery. If you don't want to watch the whole video and you're just looking for a specific section, check the description of the video below, and I'll put time codes there so you can jump straight to where you want to be. So the first consideration before doing anything is, are you set to the default physics settings? So I recommend you go into experimental. First of all, make sure that climbing is disabled, because climbing kind of changes how the physics works. So if you're just getting used to dismemberment, this isn't a good idea to have this enabled. And the second thing is then to make sure in experimental weapon handling you have all those set to default, just because before you go messing with those, it's worth understanding how the game is supposed to work before you start making changes to the physics system. For a successful decapitation or dismemberment, there are three factors being taken into consideration: force, velocity, and accuracy of angle. The first big question you really want to ask yourself is, do you truly understand how the combat system works in the game? Because if you don't, you're probably going to have a really bad time getting this to work, since you're struggling with the actual non-one-to-one tracking in the first place. So to explain what force, velocity and accuracy mean, this would be an example of a forceful blow. That would do a lot of damage to an enemy. This being an attack with high velocity could also be considered like speed, but that might not do a lot of attacks. That would be just a lot of little slashing wounds. Now here is an attack that uses both velocity and force. Now, people struggle with this kind of stuff. You always hear people complaining about, oh, cutting doesn't do damage. It's just that it's hard to get used to. But there's a sweet spot, as I always like to say, for all weapons, where you can get the perfect balance of force and velocity. And that's really what you want to be aiming for. The next part to consider is accuracy. And what I mean by that is you simply just need the correct angle for where you're going to cut off the appendage. And if you miss these angles, even by a little bit, it won't work at all. You'll just end up doing some slashing damage. And this is kind of why people are finding it tricky. This is just how it is. It is a skill-based system, and it is not supposed to be easy. So don't beat yourself up too much if you find it hard at first. The final considerations are different weapons will have inherent differences in their force and velocity. So consider, if you were to hit someone with a greatsword, you send them flying. Versus the dagger, it's so much quicker than the greatsword, but it doesn't send them flying at all. This will factor into decaps, and so a lot of people find that it's actually a little bit easier to do decaps with the bigger, heavier weapons, specifically the greatsword, the Dane axe, and actually the axe is quite nice too. But it is possible to do decaps and dismemberment with every weapon, including the dagger and rapier. Also consider that slow motion can change how it all works, because just like in slow motion, when you punch a guy and he goes flying, this is because force is greatly ramped up in slow motion. However, as you might imagine, velocity is greatly reduced in slow motion. So again, if you're trying to do decaps or dismemberment in slow motion, that's also going to factor into this whole equation also. In terms of where you can cut off, it's a little bit unintuitive actually. The sever points on the enemy are actually the neck, and so what you're going to want to do there is that is a directly horizontal cut across the neck. You can also go from the shoulder, above the elbow, below the elbow, the wrist, the thigh, above the knee, below the knee, and the foot. If you ever saw a video of anyone getting cut in half across the torso, that was a mod. So this is the angles that you want to cut. So it's a little counterintuitive, because for something like the elbow, you're probably thinking the cut point is on the bend of the elbow, when in actual fact, it's a little bit above and a little bit below it. This can be even more complicated when the enemy is moving around and dodging, because it's hard trying to be accurate when the enemy is jumping all over the place. It's tricky and it requires practice. That is just the way it is. It's a skill-based system in this game. And if you're thinking about it like Gorn, you're just thinking about it wrong. That's not how it is. So to break it down in detail, let's start by cutting off some shoulders. So remember, you're always going to want to cut horizontally across the appendage, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be making a horizontal slash. So look here, this guy's arm is a little bit at an angle. So that means if I want to cut horizontally across it, I'm actually going to be striking at a little bit of a downward angle. And then the same on the other side. There you go. It is possible to sever shoulders from a downward angle along the joint like this. But it's a lot trickier because the hitbox is more fine, so there's way more opportunity to miss the sever point. And it's even more complicated when you consider the enemy is moving around a bunch also. With the elbow, it's the same again. You're going to want to go straight across the appendage, but remember that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a horizontal slash. It's going to be relative to the angle of the arm itself, and you're aiming a little bit above and a little bit below the joint. The wrist, same again, straight across, but this is one of the trickier ones because consider how often do the enemy have their hands down by their side. So for me, this is one that I find I actually cut off mostly by accident. The lower limbs operate much the same way as the upper limbs when it comes to severing, with the same difficulty that you have to take into consideration the angle relative to how the enemy is standing. So typically the enemies will always slightly bend their knees when they're fighting. So take that into consideration because it can enable you to easily miss your mark. But if you're precise enough, you can take the limb right off. Decapitation is, in my opinion, probably the easiest thing to pull off because unlike the limbs, 9 out of 10 times, despite the enemy jumping around, the head will be at the same fixed angle. So all you're needing there is a nice, clean, horizontal strike to take the head right off. So that is it for the Baron's official guide to dismemberment and blade and sorcery. If you liked this video or if you found it useful, you could always consider subscribing for the latest news and blade and sorcery, as well as previews, trailers, and behind the scenes information on how the development is going. If there's enough interest, I would be open to doing more of these kind of tutorial videos. Just let me know what kind of videos you guys would want to see. Thanks for watching, and until next time, cheers.